The midday sun streamed through the large windows of Sierra Grill, a modest yet bustling restaurant in Carmel by the Sea, California. It wasn't high-end, but it had its charm, part rustic, part modern, the kind of place locals loved, especially on a warm Thursday afternoon. For Megan, a 23-year-old waitress struggling to make ends meet, charm wasn't enough to soften her frustration. Her shift had been chaotic from the moment she clocked in. "Table 7 needs extra dressing," a fellow server called out. Megan didn't glance up as she scribbled an order onto her notepad. Her ponytail swayed as she rushed between tables, juggling complaints about undercooked steaks, split checks, and forgotten drink orders. 3 rude customers in the past hour had left her with nothing but a few coins as tips. By the time an older man strolled in and quietly took a seat at a corner table, Megan was already on edge. He looked like someone who didn't care much for appearances. A slightly wrinkled flannel shirt, faded jeans, and a well-worn Stetson, resting on the table. His boots had clearly seen decades of dirt roads. Megan gave him a quick once-over, lips curling into a faint smirk. "Great," she muttered under her breath. "Another one who's probably going to order a coffee and leave me $1. But she couldn't avoid him forever. Her coworker nudged her. "You've got table 12. Megan sighed, grabbed her notepad, and plastered on her best fake smile as she approached. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her tone tinged with impatience. The man looked up, his sharp eyes, scanning her face for a moment. Something about him felt oddly familiar, but Megan couldn't place it. "Just a burger," he said calmly, his voice low and gravelly, carrying a weight that commanded respect. "Burger. Got it. Anything else?" Megan tapped her pen against the notepad. "No, ma'am," he replied, tipping his hat slightly. She rolled her eyes as she walked back to the kitchen. "Ma'am? Really?" she muttered under her breath. Still, something about him stood out. Unlike the demanding, impatient customers she'd dealt with all day, he had an unshakable calmness, almost as if he was watching and waiting for something. Megan returned to table 12 with the man's burger a few minutes later. The plate clattered onto the table with less care than usual. She was running on fumes, her smile more forced than ever. The man didn't react, or if he did, he hid it well. "Here you go," Megan said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She set a ketchup bottle next to his plate. "Anything else?" The man glanced at the burger, then back at her. "No, this looks just fine. Thank you." His words were polite, but there was a firmness in his tone that made Megan feel oddly self-conscious. She lingered for a moment, unsure why she hadn't already moved on. Something about his demeanor annoyed her. Maybe it was the calmness, the unshakable composure. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked abruptly, leaning on the edge of the table. "No, I'm not," he replied simply, cutting his burger in half with deliberate precision. "Thought so," she said, smirking. The hat gave it away. "Looks like you just stepped out of an old Western movie." For the first time, the man smiled, just a faint curve of his lips. "Something like that," he said. Megan expected him to get defensive, but he didn't. That frustrated her more. She was tired of being polite, tired of holding back her thoughts. "You know," she said, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret, "most people around here don't show up looking like they just came from a ranch." He didn't respond immediately, taking a slow bite of his burger. Then, after a moment, he said, "I guess I'm not most people." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight Megan didn't expect. A flicker of embarrassment surfaced, but she quickly buried it. "Well, enjoy your meal," she said, pushing herself off the table and walking away before he could say anything else. She was sure she'd gotten the last word. But as she cleared another table nearby, she noticed him watching her, not in a creepy way, but with an expression that made her feel like she was being evaluated. Judged, even. It was unsettling, and she couldn't figure out why it bothered her so much. The lunch rush began to wind down, and the restaurant grew quieter. Megan finally had a chance to catch her breath. Leaning against the counter, she scrolled through her phone while keeping an eye on her tables. Her gaze flicked to table 12, where the man was finishing his meal. He seemed in no hurry, sipping his water and glancing around the restaurant with quiet curiosity. "Hey, Megan," her coworker Danny said as he walked by. "Isn't it weird how calm that guy is? Like he's just taking it all in." Megan shrugged. "Yeah, well, some people have all the time in the world," Danny chuckled. "Maybe he's famous or something. He looks familiar, doesn't he?" Megan rolled her eyes. "Famous? Yeah, right. If he's famous, then I'm the—" Megan felt a flicker of anger rise in her chest. Was he lecturing her? She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, he stood up and reached into his pocket for his wallet. "I'll leave you with that thought," he said, placing a few bills on the table. "Thanks for the meal." As he walked toward the door, Megan muttered under her breath, "Yeah, whatever, cowboy." But just as he reached the exit, something strange happened. The manager, a no-nonsense woman named Carol, hurried out from the back office. Her face lit up when she saw the man, and she extended her hand enthusiastically. "Mr. Eastwood, I wasn't expecting you today," Carol said, her voice filled with respect. Megan froze. Her stomach dropped as she replayed the name in her head. Eastwood. Clint Eastwood. She whipped her head toward the door, her eyes widening as she saw him turn back briefly to shake Carol's hand. His eyes caught hers for just a moment, a knowing look passing between them before he walked out the door. And in that moment, Megan realized she hadn't just insulted an unassuming customer. She'd insulted the owner of the restaurant. Megan stood frozen in place, her notepad clutched tightly in her hand. She stared at the door Clint Eastwood had just walked through, her mind racing. Did she really just brush off Clint Eastwood? The Clint Eastwood? And not just that, he was the owner of the restaurant. Her heart started pounding as Carol turned toward her. "Megan," she called, waving her over. "Can you believe it? Mr. Eastwood stopped by today. He's been so busy lately. I haven't seen him in weeks." Yeah. That's... Wow," Megan stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Carol didn't seem to notice Megan's discomfort. She was too busy gushing. "You know, this place means the world to him. He's so hands-on. Every detail here is something he's personally approved. That's why we're always reminding staff to bring their best. You never know when he'll stop by." Megan felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She replayed every word she'd said to him, every snarky comment, every eye roll. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. "Are you okay?" Danny asked, noticing Megan's pale face. I think I need a minute," Megan muttered, retreating to the break room. As soon as the door closed behind her, she let out a shaky breath and sank into a chair. How could she have been so oblivious? She'd been working at Sierra Grill for 2 years, and in all that time she'd never bothered to pay attention to the stories about the mysterious owner. If she had, maybe she'd have recognized him, or at least thought twice before running her mouth. Her mind was spinning, but one thought stood out. What now? But Megan had no idea that Clint wasn't done with her just yet. The next day, Megan arrived at work with a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She hadn't slept well, replaying the events of the previous day in her mind. Every time she thought about Clint Eastwood's calm demeanor and the look he gave her as he left, she cringed. What if he told Carol about her attitude? What if she got fired? She couldn't afford to lose this job, not with rent due in 2 weeks and her student loans piling up. She spent the first half of her shift avoiding eye contact with Carol and doing everything she could to keep her customers happy, smiling, apologizing, refilling drinks before anyone even had to ask. It was the most effort she'd put into her job in months. By the time lunch rolled around, the restaurant was humming with activity. Megan was wiping down a table when she heard the unmistakable gravelly voice she hadn't been able to forget. "Well, looks like you're busy today." She turned sharply to see Clint Eastwood standing near the counter. His hands rested casually in his pockets. He was dressed much the same as the day before, but this time his presence felt even more commanding. Megan's heart sank. She forced a nervous smile, trying to think of what to say. Mr. Eastwood. Hi. I didn't know you'd be back so soon." He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I like to check in on my places from time to time. Keeps everyone on their toes." Megan swallowed hard, her palms sweaty. "Right. Well, everything's running great today." He gave a small nod, then glanced around the restaurant. "I see that, but you seem a little tense." She froze. Of course, he noticed. He probably noticed everything. "I just about yesterday." He held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "No need to apologize," he said calmly. "I'm not here to make your life harder." She blinked, caught off guard by his response. "You're not?" "No," he said, his voice steady. "But I do think there's a lesson here. You never know who you're talking to or what they might be going through. A little kindness goes a long way." Megan's throat tightened. She didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded, feeling a lump form in her chest. "Look, I've had bad days too," Clint continued, his tone softening. "But the way you handle those days says a lot about who you are, and trust me, people notice." She could feel her face turning red. His words weren't harsh, but they hit harder than any scolding ever could. He wasn't trying to embarrass her. He was trying to teach her something. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean it." He gave her a small smile. "You're welcome. Just remember, every interaction's an opportunity. Use it well." With that, he tipped his hat and walked out, leaving Megan standing there, overwhelmed with a mix of emotions. And, for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of something she hadn't expected, the desire to be better. Over the next few weeks, Megan couldn't shake Clint's words. They replayed in her mind every time she stepped onto the restaurant floor. Every interaction's an opportunity. Use it well. At first, she didn't know how to start making changes. She wasn't the type to flash fake smiles or gush over customers like some of her co-workers did. But Clint's calm demeanor and quiet wisdom had struck a chord. She didn't have to pretend to be someone she wasn't. She just needed to show a little more patience, a little more care. So she started small. When a frazzled mom with 3 kids spilled a soda across the table, Megan didn't sigh or roll her eyes. Instead, she grabbed a rag, smiled, and said, "Don't worry, it happens to the best of us." When an elderly couple asked her to repeat the specials 3 times, she didn't let her frustration show. She patiently explained them again, even adding her own recommendations. And the thing that surprised her most? The more effort she put into treating people kindly, the better she felt. One evening, near the end of her shift, Carol called Megan into the office. Megan's stomach twisted with nerves as she stepped inside, fearing the worst. "You've been working here for a while," Carol began, folding her hands on the desk. "And I've noticed a change in you lately. A good one." Megan blinked, unsure how to respond. "Oh, thank you." "I don't know what brought it on," Carol continued, "but whatever you're doing, keep it up. The customers have noticed too. One of them even left a comment card the other day, praising your service." Megan felt her chest swell with a mix of pride and disbelief. She hadn't expected anyone to notice her efforts, let alone acknowledge them. As she left the office, a smile tugged at her lips. She still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. That night, as she locked up the restaurant, she glanced at the sign out front. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was a place where she could grow, learn, and maybe even make a difference. And she owed it all to the quiet cowboy who'd walked in one busy afternoon and taught her a lesson she'd never forget. Because sometimes the smallest interactions have the biggest impact, and every moment is a chance to become someone better. If this story inspired you, hit the like button and share it with someone who could use a little encouragement. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life lessons and stories that remind us all to be a little kinder every day.